The supply closet was designed to hold 80 pounds of sterile gauze, not 200 pounds of furious, hyper-vigilant apex predator. Torin Cross stepped forward, his broad shoulders eclipsing the single fluorescent bulb overhead. The air in the tiny space instantly evaporated, replaced by the suffocating heat radiating off his skin. He didn't say a word. He just backed me against the metal shelving with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who owned everything he looked at. I gripped the edge of my clipboard, my knuckles turning stark white. Every rational synapse in my brain screamed at me to bolt, but my stubborn pride pinned my sneakers to the linoleum. I was a doctor who wrestled sedated rhinos. I refused to be intimidated by a man who, strictly speaking, belonged in a very large kennel. I lifted my chin, meeting his unnerving stare with pure, concentrated spite. "I'm not scared of you," I lied. Torin stopped. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, before he leaned down. The movement was entirely too smooth. His face hovered inches from my neck, sending a dangerous electric shiver straight down my spine. I stopped breathing. He tilted his head, listening intently. A slow, infuriating smirk curved the corner of his mouth. "Your heartbeat disagrees." "It's caffeine," I snapped, my voice trembling entirely against my will. He leaned a fraction closer, invading the absolute last safe inch of my space. So, I did the only medically sound thing I could think of. I brought my knee sharply up into his thigh.
Hey lovers, before we get locked inside a freezing clinic with a furious 200-pound alpha king, I need you to do me a massive favor. If you love fiercely stubborn heroines and touch her and die tension, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new romance. Also, we are trying something completely new today. I want you to listen closely to the voice bringing this story to life and tell me in the comments what you think about the narrator. Does she nail the sarcasm? Are we keeping her for the next story? Let me know your vote down below. All right, grab a heavy blanket, get comfortable, and let's dive in.
Chapter 1. 2 hours before I ended up cornered in a supply closet, my biggest problem was a jammed espresso machine and a Category 4 blizzard burying downtown Chicago. The emergency clinic was a sterile stainless steel sanctuary. I liked it that way. Animals made sense. People left, lied, or stopped returning your calls. But a fractured tibia? You put a surgical pin in it and it healed. Simple. Predictable. Then the front doors blew open. A violent gust of snow blasted into the lobby, followed immediately by 3 frantic, freezing men dragging a heavy canvas tarp. On that tarp was the largest, most terrifying timber wolf I had ever seen outside of a wildlife sanctuary. He was easily 200 pounds of midnight black muscle, and he was currently convulsing, vomiting a thick black substance onto my freshly mopped floor. "Doc, you have to help him!" the tallest man shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "He's burning up! He's losing his mind!" I didn't ask questions. At 2 in the morning, you don't ask for insurance cards. I grabbed my emergency trauma kit and slid across the wet tiles, dropping to my knees beside the heaving animal. The sheer heat radiating off the wolf's body was shocking. It felt like kneeling next to a radiator cranked to maximum. The scent of ozone, wet earth, and something sharply metallic, like copper wiring, flooded the tight space. "Hold his head," I ordered, uncapping a massive syringe of broad-spectrum antiemetics. But the moment the needle brushed his thick fur, the wolf's eyes snapped open. They weren't clouded with sickness. They were razor-sharp, gold, and completely enraged. He didn't just growl. He produced a sound so deep it actually vibrated the heavy metal trauma shears in my pocket. He lunged, his jaws snapping inches from my wrist in a blinding blur of teeth. The three men scrambled backward in sheer terror. I didn't flinch. I had spent 3 years at the San Diego Zoo wrestling sedated silverbacks. I was entirely out of patience for bad behavior. Absolutely not, I snapped. I tossed the standard syringe, reached blindly into my medical cart, and pulled out the rhino-grade tranquilizer I kept specifically for worst-case scenarios. The wolf bared his teeth, bracing his massive paws to lunge again. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the heavy-duty dart directly into his thickest shoulder muscle and hit the plunger. The effect was instantaneous. The gold in his eyes widened in sheer, disoriented panic. He let out one furious, indignant huff, and then his massive head hit the linoleum with a heavy thud. "All right," I exhaled, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Get him onto a reinforced gurney, exam room 3. It took all 4 of us to hoist his dead weight onto the stainless steel examination table. I patched him up, ran a preliminary blood draw, and secured him inside our maximum security recovery kennel. I locked the titanium deadbolt myself, welcoming the quiet predictability of a sleeping patient. The blizzard quickly upgraded to a complete whiteout, rattling the clinic's reinforced windows. I sat at the reception desk, finally fixing that espresso machine, perfectly content with my quiet, controlled environment. Then I glanced up at the security feed for exam room 3. The titanium kennel door was still locked tight, but the wolf was gone. Instead, a fully naked, furiously glaring man was standing inside the cage, staring directly into the camera lens. Chapter 2. I stared at the grainy security monitor, blinking slowly. The titanium kennel in exam room 3 was meant for aggressive mastiffs. It was not meant for a towering, broad-shouldered man with a jawline carved from granite, who was currently entirely naked and glaring at the camera lens with enough intensity to shatter the glass. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. Instead, I let out a long, exhausted exhale, rubbed the bridge of my nose, and grabbed a stack of oversized mint green surgical scrubs from the linen cart. The walk down the isolated hallway was accompanied by the aggressive shrieking of the blizzard outside. The emergency clinic's reinforced windows rattled in their frames. When I swiped my keycard and pushed open the heavy door to exam room 3, the air inside was already thick, heavy with that strange ozone and copper scent that had clung to his fur. He stood in the center of the spacious kennel, gripping the reinforced mesh door. He was magnificent in a terrifying, primal way. Scars tracing his ribs, muscles coiled with lethal tension. But it was very difficult to be intimidated by a man wearing a translucent plastic Elizabethan veterinary collar. I had secured the cone around his neck while he was a wolf, to prevent him from tearing out the intravenous line. Now, in human form, the wide plastic dish sat awkwardly around his throat, framing his furious expression like a terrible medical halo. "Unlock this door," he demanded. His voice wasn't just deep, it was a physical weight. It vibrated against my sternum, carrying a strange resonant frequency that demanded absolute compliance. I dropped the mint green scrubs onto the exam table and crossed my arms. "Absolutely not. The last time you were out of that cage, you tried to take my wrist off. I have a very strict policy against being mauled on a Tuesday." "I am the alpha of the Midwest Territory," he said, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the metal wire so tightly the joints turned white. "You will open this cage or I will tear it out of the drywall." "You're welcome to try," I said, leaning casually against the counter. "That's aerospace-grade titanium, but if you break a tooth, I'm billing you for the dental extraction." He stared at me, sheer disbelief warring with his towering arrogance. It was entirely obvious that no one had ever spoken to him this way. He was used to people dropping to their knees, not citing billing policies. "I need to get to my pack," he growled, the sound low and dangerous. "You need to put on a pair of pants," I countered, kicking the folded scrubs toward the cage. "And you need to sit down. You have an unidentified toxin tearing through your bloodstream, and your internal temperature is reading at 105 degrees. Before he could argue, a massive mechanical groan echoed through the building. The blizzard had finally reached its peak. Heavy steel storm shutters slammed down over the exterior windows in a synchronized, echoing sequence. The automated lockdown. We were officially sealed inside. He looked at the shutters, then back at me. "Open the door." "Promise you won't bite the staff?" I deadpanned. "I am not a dog," he roared, his patience entirely snapping. He reached up, grabbed the plastic rim of the cone of shame, and violently ripped it in half. The plastic shattered. But the exertion was a massive mistake. The moment the collar hit the floor, his eyes rolled back. A violent tremor wrecked his massive frame, and thick, toxic black veins suddenly flared against the skin of his neck. He didn't even have time to brace himself before he collapsed forward, his heavy shoulder slamming against the bulletproof glass as he slid to the linoleum, completely unconscious. Chapter 3. I punched the override code into the keypad before he even hit the floor. The heavy door unlatched with a metallic clack. I grabbed the scrubs and my trauma kit, rushing into the enclosure. Up close, the sheer size of him was overwhelming. I threw the mint green pants over his lap for basic decency and pressed 2 fingers hard against his carotid artery. His pulse was chaotic, racing, then skipping, then pounding so hard I could feel it against my own skin. "Hey," I said sharply, tapping his cheek. "Hey, stay with me. Look at me." His golden eyes snapped open. Instinct, pure and unfiltered, took over. Before I could blink, his hand shot out, wrapping around my waist. He flipped our positions in a blur of motion, pinning me flat against the cold wall of the kennel. His heavy chest pressed against mine, his intense, radiating heat completely shocking my system. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his face inches from mine, his breath ragged. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. I knew he could hear it. I knew he could smell the spike of my adrenaline. The power imbalance was staggering. He could snap my neck with a twitch of his wrist. But I was Dr. Vera Hayes. I didn't do helpless. I reached blindly to my left, my fingers wrapping around the thick, hardcover spine of Advanced Exotic Pathology, Volume 4. I brought the 3-pound textbook up and slammed it squarely into the center of his chest. Thwack. He blinked, shock momentarily overriding his aggressive instincts. He loosened his grip just enough for me to shove him backward. "Personal space!" I barked, pointing the textbook at him like a weapon. "I just saved your life, you ungrateful, overgrown carpet. I am the only doctor in a 50-mile radius who isn't currently buried under 4 feet of snow. So you are going to put on those pants, step out of this cage, and sit on that exam table before I sedate you again. Do we understand each other?" He stared at me, rubbing his chest where the book had connected. The fury in his eyes slowly shifted into a strange, intense calculation. His gaze dropped to my racing pulse at the base of my throat, then back to my eyes. A slow, highly inappropriate smirk touched his lips. "You're shaking, Doctor." "It's the adrenaline of dealing with difficult patients," I lied smoothly. "Pants. Now." I spun on my heel, marching out of the cage to the blood centrifuge on the counter, desperately trying to ignore the sound of rustling fabric behind me. When I finally turned around, he was sitting on the edge of the steel exam table. The scrubs hung low on his hips, his broad, scarred chest fully exposed to the harsh fluorescent lights. "Torin," he said. His voice was quieter now, a low, rumbling baritone that did entirely unfair things to my nervous system. "My name is Torin Cross." "Congratulations, Torin. Let's see what's killing you." I pulled his blood vial from the earlier draw and slotted it into the mass spectrometer. Torin immediately slid off the table, stepping up right behind me. He didn't touch me, but he didn't have to. His body heat enveloped my back like a heavy blanket. "Work faster," he ordered. "I am working at the speed of science," I shot back, refusing to turn around and acknowledge how close he was. The machine whirred, processing the heavy metals and enzymes in his blood. We stood there in silence, the air between us thick with unresolved tension. Finally, the screen flashed red. I leaned forward, my brow furrowing as I read the output. It wasn't a standard poison. It wasn't a heavy metal. The screen blinked a single, terrifying line of text. "Critical error. Unrecognized synthetic pathogen." Chapter 4. The sharp beep of the pathology machine was instantly swallowed by a massive, hollow boom from the basement. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, hummed a dying note, and snapped off. The clinic plunged into total darkness for 3 agonizing seconds before the emergency battery strips along the baseboards kicked on, casting the exam room in a dim, eerie red glow. Then, the low, steady hum of the ventilation system ground to a halt. "What was that?" Torin demanded, his voice slicing through the sudden quiet. "That," I said, staring at the darkened ceiling, "was the backup generator blowing its primary fuse, which means we still have basic battery power for the medical equipment. But the central heating just died." The temperature drop wasn't gradual. With a Category 4 whiteout raging against the exterior walls, the steel and concrete building began bleeding heat instantly. Within 20 minutes, I could see my own breath pluming in the red emergency lighting. I marched into the staff locker room and put on 2 long-sleeved undershirts, a thick fleece zip-up, and my heavy winter coat. I returned to the lab, wrapping a sterile surgical towel around my neck like a scarf. Torin was still sitting on the exam table, wearing nothing but the thin cotton scrub pants. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't even producing goosebumps. "Aren't you freezing?" I asked, my teeth chattering slightly as I booted up the battery-powered microscope. He leaned back on his hands, looking entirely too comfortable. "My resting biological temperature is 105 degrees. The cold doesn't bother me." I glared at him. It was deeply unfair. He was essentially a walking 200-pound space heater, and he knew it. "You look ridiculous," he noted, gesturing lazily to my layers. "I look like a professional who is trying to solve your synthetic pathogen problem," I snapped, leaning over the eyepiece of the microscope to manually count his compromised white blood cells. "You're shaking so hard you're going to knock the slide off the glass." Torin tilted his head, his golden eyes tracking my rigid posture. "Come here." "I am fine," I lied, aggressively adjusting the focus knob. "Doctor." His voice dropped an octave, hitting that resonant, commanding frequency again. Your lips are turning blue. Step away from the counter. I don't take orders in my own clinic, I retorted, though my fingers were beginning to feel like blocks of ice. Especially not from patients who were wearing a plastic cone an hour ago. He let out a low, vibrating chuckle. It was a dark, rich sound that annoyed me strictly because of how much I liked it. The silent battle of wills dragged on for another 10 minutes. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted to 38 degrees. My joints ached. The metal knobs of the microscope felt like burning dry ice against my skin. I tried to turn the dial to adjust the magnification. My fingers simply wouldn't grip it. They slipped, numb and clumsy, knocking the glass slide completely off the stage. It shattered on the counter. I squeezed my eyes shut, a heavy sigh of pure frustration escaping my lips. I didn't hear him move. I just felt the sudden, overwhelming wall of heat stop directly behind me. Stubborn, Torin murmured, his chest brushing against my heavy winter coat. I dropped my head, my numb fingers resting uselessly on the counter. I didn't push him away. I didn't cite personal space. I just stood there, silently conceding defeat as the agonizing, incredible warmth of the Alpha King finally thawed the ice in my veins. Chapter 5. I stood perfectly still, letting the agonizing, incredible heat radiating from Torin's chest seep through my heavy winter coat. For exactly 10 seconds, I allowed myself the luxury of not freezing to death. The deep, vibrating hum of his breathing against my spine felt dangerously close to a purr, though I knew if I pointed that out, he would likely throw me through a wall. Better, Torin murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp right beside my ear. Marginally, I rasped back, forcing my newly thawed fingers to grip the edge of the counter. I reluctantly stepped forward, breaking the contact. The chill of the room instantly bit into my skin again, but my brain was functioning enough to prep a fresh glass slide. Don't flatter yourself. You're just a very muscular space heater. Whatever helps you maintain your professional boundaries, Doctor. The smug amusement in his tone was practically audible. I ignored him, carefully swabbing a new sample of his blood and placing it under the battery-powered microscope. The red emergency lights cast long, ominous shadows across the lab, making the entire situation feel like a post-apocalyptic medical drama. I squinted into the eyepiece, manually adjusting the dials. Okay, let's look at the cellular structure of this synthetic pathogen, I muttered, mostly to myself. It's not a heavy metal. It's not a botanical poison. The protein chains are entirely uniform, artificially structured. It looks like an advanced agricultural enzyme, but heavily mutated. Agricultural? Torin's amusement vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory edge. He stepped closer, crowding my space again. Like pesticide? No, I said, tapping the heavy textbook beside the microscope. Like livestock modification. Specifically, a bioengineered preservative used in mass-produced, low-grade meat supply chains. The kind of stuff highly regulated out of human consumption, but legally murky in commercial animal feed. Torin went absolutely rigid. The overwhelming heat of his body seemed to spike. The winter reserves, he growled. I spun around, leaning my lower back against the counter. Excuse me? My PAX compound is deep in the Northern Territory. 2 days ago, we received a shipment from a new corporate vendor to stock our deep freezers for the winter. Venison and beef. Half the enforcers ate from the first batch before I collapsed. So it's not an attack, I concluded, the clinical side of my brain racing. It's massive, catastrophic food poisoning on a biological level. It's an attack if they knew what they were selling us, he countered, his jaw clenching so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He began pacing the narrow length of the lab, his sheer size making the room feel like a shoebox. His pacing wasn't human. It was a tight, hyper-vigilant stalking pattern. The pathogen in his blood was clearly messing with his neurological baseline, throwing his primal instincts into overdrive. He abruptly stopped, his head snapping toward me. His golden eyes locked onto my face, the pupils blown wide in the dim red light. "What?" I asked, my heart giving a sudden, violent kick against my ribs. He stepped directly into my personal space, closing the distance in 2 massive strides. He didn't touch me, but he leaned over my shoulder, his face hovering inches from my neck. He inhaled slowly, deeply, the sound loud in the quiet room. My breath hitched. My hands gripped the edge of the counter behind me. "Your heart rate just doubled," Torin noted softly, his voice dropping into that terrifying resonant frequency. "Your pupils are dilated. You smell like fear and cheap coffee. Who are you afraid of?" Chapter 6. "I am afraid of my own impending malpractice suit if you don't back up," I snapped, bringing the plastic clipboard up to wedge firmly against his chest. Torin didn't move. He just looked down at the flimsy piece of plastic, then back up at me, entirely unimpressed by my defensive barrier. "Your instincts are going haywire because your nervous system is saturated with a biotoxin," I explained, desperately trying to keep my voice steady. "But I also think you're aggressively pacing because you're covered in dried bio-waste from the parking lot, and your brain considers it an environmental contaminant." He blinked, glancing down at his bare, heavily scarred chest. "I am not dirty." "You threw up a black, toxic substance on my freshly mopped lobby floor, and then I dragged you across it," I pointed out flatly. "You smell like ozone, wet earth, and medical-grade floor cleaner. You need decontamination." "I am not showering in a veterinary clinic," Torin growled, his pride instantly rearing its head. "Good, because the human showers in the staff locker room run on the primary plumbing line, which is currently frozen solid." I tossed the clipboard onto the counter and grabbed a massive, fluffy white towel from the linen rack. "But the industrial grooming bay in the back runs on the heated, pressurized emergency reservoir. Congratulations, you're getting a bath." It took a ridiculous amount of arguing, 2 direct threats regarding the rhino tranquilizer, and a final exhausted glare from me to get the Alpha King of the Midwest to march into the grooming bay. The room was dominated by a massive stainless steel tub designed for bathing St. Bernards and Great Danes. It had a reinforced ramp and a heavy-duty coiled spray hose hanging from the ceiling. Torin stood in the center of the giant metal basin, the mint-green scrub pants hanging low on his hips, looking like a furious captive gladiator. "If you tell anyone about this," he warned, his voice echoing off the tiled walls, "I will burn this building to the ground." "Noted," I said cheerfully, flipping the valve. The industrial hose blasted a high-pressure stream of warm water directly into his chest. Torin gasped, instinctively bracing his legs against the onslaught. I didn't give him a chance to complain. I grabbed a gallon jug of hypoallergenic oatmeal shampoo and squirted a generous handful directly onto his broad shoulders. "This is completely unnecessary," he grumbled, though he noticeably leaned into the hot water. "It's basic medical hygiene," I corrected, stepping up onto the raised platform beside the tub. "Hold still." I reached over the edge, burying my hands in his thick, dark hair. Torin instantly froze. The banter died in his throat. My fingers worked the foaming shampoo through his scalp, massaging the heavy tension out of his neck muscles. It was an entirely clinical action, yet the sudden, stark intimacy of it sent a hot flush crawling up the back of my own neck. He was so incredibly large, so undeniably lethal. Yet he was standing perfectly still, allowing me to carefully wash the grime from his skin. "You're remarkably compliant when there's a head massage involved," I murmured, the sarcasm lacking its usual bite. Torin didn't respond. He simply closed his eyes, a heavy, jagged exhale leaving his lips. I moved my hands lower, rinsing the suds from the base of his skull. As my thumb dragged across the nape of his neck, it caught on a thick, raised ridge of tissue. It was a massive, jagged scar hidden beneath his hairline, the kind of violent, traumatic injury that should have severed his spine completely. The moment my skin grazed the scar, Torin violently flinched. His eyes snapped open, blazing gold, and the fragile, humorous peace in the room vanished instantly. Chapter 7. His hand clamped around my wrist with terrifying speed. It wasn't a painful grip, but it was an absolute, immovable restraint. Torin turned his head, staring at me with a look so haunted and defensive that it entirely stripped away his arrogant facade. The running water from the overhead hose splashed loudly against the steel basin, the only sound in the suddenly suffocating room. "Don't," he commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a physical blow. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, dropping the hose into the tub. It clattered against the metal, shutting off the flow of water. I didn't try to pull my wrist away. I recognized a trauma response when I saw one. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just rinsing the soap." He stared at my face for a long, agonizing second, scanning my eyes for pity. When he found none, only clinical calm, his grip slowly loosened. He let my hand drop and stepped backward, out of my reach. "I'll finish it myself," he muttered, grabbing the towel from the edge of the tub. I stepped down from the platform, suddenly feeling entirely exhausted. The adrenaline of the last few hours was finally crashing, leaving a hollow, aching fatigue in my bones. I walked back to exam room 3, listening to the heavy rustle of toweling off from down the hall. When Torin finally emerged, the towering, terrifying Alpha was completely gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he was slowly being crushed to death by an invisible weight. He had pulled the scrubs back on, but his shoulders slumped, and the dark circles under his eyes were stark against his pale skin. The biotoxin was ravaging his system, yes, but this level of exhaustion went far deeper than a contaminated meat supply. He walked over to the examination cot and sank onto the edge, dropping his head into his hands. "How long since you actually slept, Torin?" I asked quietly, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look up. "The toxin is interfering with my neurological receptors. My brain won't cross the threshold into REM sleep. It's just a constant waking nightmare." "I know what the toxin is doing," I pressed gently. "But I also know what long-term sleep deprivation looks like. You haven't rested properly in months, have you?" He let out a harsh, dry laugh that sounded like sandpaper. "Do you know what happens when an alpha sleeps, Doctor? The pack is vulnerable. The territory is open. Every rival, every threat, every challenge, they wait for you to close your eyes. So, I don't." The sheer, crushing burden of it hit me squarely in the chest. My abandonment issues were a defensive wall. His were a literal matter of life and death for hundreds of people. I didn't say a word. I walked over to the heavy storage cabinet, pulled out a massive 30-pound weighted anxiety blanket designed to calm post-surgical Great Danes, and dragged it over to the cot. I draped it heavily over his broad shoulders. Torin stiffened at the sudden weight. But then, slowly, a deep, shuddering sigh racked his chest. The artificial pressure was doing exactly what it was designed to do, forcing his central nervous system to physically ground itself. He leaned back against the wall, pulling the heavy fabric tighter around himself. His golden eyes tracked me as I moved to sit in the rolling medical chair across from him, my knees practically brushing his. The red emergency lights flickered softly. The storm raged outside, a muffled roar against the thick glass. Torrin's eyelids finally, miraculously, began to droop. But right before they closed completely, he reached out from beneath the blanket. His large, warm fingers wrapped loosely around the cuff of my heavy winter coat. "Vera," he murmured, his voice slurring with exhaustion. It was the first time he had used my actual name. "If I fall asleep, promise me you won't leave the room." I looked down at his massive fingers loosely curled around the cuff of my coat. The grip wasn't a demand, it was an anchor. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly, the lie feeling entirely too real in my chest. Torrin didn't respond. The heavy, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest under the weighted blanket signaled that the exhaustion had finally dragged him under. I sat back in the rolling chair, pulling my knees up to my chest in a desperate bid to conserve body heat. The emergency batteries kept the medical monitors glowing a faint cinematic red, casting sharp, high-definition shadows across the metallic surfaces of exam room 3. Outside, the blizzard was throwing heavy sheets of ice against the reinforced steel shutters. The sound was deafening, a relentless, shrieking reminder of our total isolation. An hour passed. Then 2. The ambient temperature inside the clinic plummeted past uncomfortable and landed squarely on dangerous. My breath plumed in the air, thick and white. The heavy fleece of my coat was completely useless against the creeping, bone-deep cold. My toes were entirely numb, and a violent shiver began to rack my spine, rattling my teeth together. I checked the digital wall thermometer. 31 degrees. We were officially below freezing. I looked at the narrow examination cot. Torrin was sprawled across it, the 30-pound weighted blanket covering him from the waist down. The ambient heat radiating off his exposed torso was actually distorting the air above him in faint, shimmering waves. My clinical brain ran the calculus. Hypothermia sets in when the core body temperature drops below 95 degrees. My fine motor skills were already failing. If I went into shock, I couldn't run the pathology slides. If I couldn't run the slides, he died. This wasn't a choice. It was a thermal exchange protocol, purely medical. I stood up, my joints popping in protest, and awkwardly shuffled over to the cot. "Move over," I whispered, nudging his heavy thigh with my knee. He was deeply unconscious, locked in a comatose state by the toxin, but his primal biology responded to the physical contact. With a low, unconscious rumble in his chest, he shifted his massive frame, giving me exactly 6 inches of mattress. I carefully lifted the edge of the heavy quilted blanket and slid underneath it, keeping my back strictly turned toward him. The sensory overload was immediate and utterly paralyzing. It was like climbing into a running furnace. The sheer, overwhelming heat of him engulfed me instantly, thawing the ice in my veins with an agonizing rush. The scent of ozone and rich, damp earth completely filled my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body practically humming with hyper-awareness. I tried to keep a rigid, defensive distance, balancing precariously on the very edge of the steel frame. But gravity and the sheer weight of the blanket conspired against me. The mattress dipped under his 200-pound frame, and I inevitably slid backward. My spine gently collided with the solid, immovable wall of his chest. Torrin's breathing hitched. He didn't wake, but his biology registered my presence. The tension in the room skyrocketed. I lay perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was officially sharing a bed with an apex predator. 3 hours later, the heat had done its job. My fingers were nimble again. I carefully lifted the edge of the blanket, preparing to silently slip out of the bed to check the mass spectrometer results on the counter. I shifted my weight, lifting my knee. Before my foot could touch the floor, Torin's arm shot out in a blinding blur of motion. His heavy forearm banded across my stomach, snapping me backward with terrifying ease. He hauled me flush against his chest, burying his face directly into the crook of my neck, and pinned me to the mattress in his sleep. I froze, completely trapped beneath the crushing weight of an unconscious alpha king. His breathing was slow, heavy, and hot against the sensitive skin beneath my ear. The heavy muscle of his arm felt like an iron beam locked across my ribs. I tried to mentally calculate the physics of rolling out from under him, but every micro-movement I made simply caused his grip to tighten. His primal instincts had firmly categorized me as a high-value asset, and he was currently hoarding me. "Torin," I hissed, tapping his forearm. "Let go of me." He grunted, shifting his weight, and threw his heavy leg over my calves, effectively turning me into a human body pillow. "Okay, this is technically kidnapping," I muttered. It took me 10 excruciating minutes of careful, agonizing wiggling, using a technique I typically reserved for escaping angry pythons, to finally slide out from beneath his grip. I shoved a rolled-up surgical towel into his arms as a replacement. He immediately crushed it to his chest with a low, satisfied growl. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the emergency kit and practically fled to the far side of the lab. My heart was racing. My face felt incredibly flushed, and I desperately needed to focus on science. I snapped the flashlight on, clamping the metal casing between my teeth, and pulled up the cross-referenced data on my battery-powered laptop. I had forced Torin to unlock his encrypted phone earlier, accessing the shipping manifests for the PAX compound. Now I laid the corporate logistics data side by side with the mass spectrometer readout. The jagged, high-definition peaks of the synthetic enzyme matched perfectly. "Got you," I whispered around the flashlight, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the exhaustion. A heavy, dangerous silence filled the room. "Got who?" I jumped, the flashlight nearly clattering to the floor. I spun around. Torin was awake. He was sitting up on the cot, the weighted blanket pooled around his waist. The heavy sleep had burned away the disorientation, leaving only a sharp, lethal clarity in his golden eyes. "The corporate meat supplier," I said, pulling the flashlight from my mouth and aiming the beam at the floor so I wouldn't blind him. "It's not just a tainted batch, Torin. The shipment came from a shell company registered to a bioagricultural firm. They intentionally infused the venison with a synthetic neurotoxin designed strictly for shifter biology. It's an engineered assassination." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Torin's jaw locked, the muscles ticking violently under his skin. "Hand me the radio," he commanded, throwing the blanket off and swinging his long legs over the side of the cot. "Now." "The radio is dead," I reminded him, stepping into his path. "And even if it wasn't, what exactly is your plan?" "I'm going to call my border enforcers. We're going to track the shipping manifest back to the corporate warehouse, and we are going to burn it to the ground with everyone inside." "No, you aren't," I countered, crossing my arms. "Because the pathogen in your blood is a biosynthetic anchor. It specifically targets the alpha strain adrenal system. If you send your enforcers into a highly stressful combat situation, their adrenaline will spike, and the toxin will hit their nervous systems 10 times faster than it hit yours. They will drop dead before they even strike a match." Torin stopped, his imposing height suddenly feeling entirely useless against cold, hard logic. He stared at me, the aggressive, retaliatory fury in his eyes clashing violently with the realization that I was entirely right. I cannot do nothing while my pack is poisoned, he snarled, the sound ripping through the quiet room. You aren't doing nothing, I said, tapping the edge of the laptop. You are funding my research. Now sit down and let me synthesize a counteragent before your nervous system. Torin didn't hear the rest of the sentence. He aggressively pushed past me, stepping toward the counter to look at the screen. But the moment he put his full weight on his right leg, his knee violently buckled. The Alpha King crashed to the linoleum floor, the heavy thud rattling the metal cabinets. Chapter 10. I dropped the flashlight and lunged forward, grabbing his heavy shoulder before his head could crack against the sharp edge of the centrifuge. Hey, don't try to stand, I grunted, bracing my boots against the floor as I hauled him up. He was dead weight, his massive frame completely betraying him. The toxin has breached the blood-brain barrier. Your motor functions are offline. Torin's breathing was ragged, his hands desperately gripping the smooth edge of the counter as he hauled himself up. The look of pure, unadulterated humiliation on his face was devastating. This was a man whose entire existence was predicated on biological supremacy, and he couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet. Get away from me, he bit out, his voice thick with self-disgust. Oh, shut up and lean on me, I snapped, slinging his heavy arm over my shoulder and dragging him backward to the examination cot. Your ego is not medically relevant right now. I dumped him onto the mattress, my chest heaving from the exertion. I immediately turned my back to him, refusing to look at him while he was completely stripped of his dignity. I focused entirely on the sterile equipment on the counter, pulling 3 fresh vials of his blood from the mini-fridge. I began mixing the synthetic counteragent, measuring exact drops of saline and protein binders into the glass tubes. The silence in the room was excruciating. The only sound was the howling wind outside and the rhythmic, aggressive pacing of Torin's breathing. Then, the battery-powered centrifuge on the counter let out a sharp, high-pitched beep. Behind me, Torin let out a low, visceral growl. I paused, holding a pipette in midair. I glanced over my shoulder. Torin was glaring at the small plastic machine as if it were a rival alpha challenging him for territory. His upper lip was actually curled, exposing the sharp edge of a canine tooth. Are you growling at the medical equipment? I asked, completely bewildered. It's making noise, he rasped, his eyes flashing a dangerous, unstable gold. It's aggressive. It's a timer, Torin. I turned back to the counter, slotting the vials into the centrifuge and hitting the start button. The machine began to hum, spinning the blood rapidly. Beep, beep, beep. Torin snarled, a deep, chest-rattling sound that vibrated the glass beakers on the shelf. He actually shifted his weight on the cot, his hands curling into fists, preparing to lunge at the machine. His protective instincts, unable to fight the invisible toxin or the blizzard, had completely short-circuited. He was trying to protect me from an appliance. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the green plastic spray bottle I used to mist the exotic reptile enclosures, spun around, and sprayed him directly in the face with a hard stream of cold water. Pfft. Torin blinked, his jaw dropping in absolute shock. A single drop of water slowly rolled down the bridge of his nose. No, I said firmly, pointing the bright green nozzle at him. Bad, Alpha. We do not threaten the centrifuge. It is currently keeping you alive. The utter absurdity of the situation hit him. The lethal, terrifying Alpha King had just been disciplined with a squirt bottle. He stared at me, then at the bottle, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, the crushing weight lifted from his shoulders. You are a menace, Doctor, he muttered, wiping his face with the back of his hand, a reluctant, exhausted smirk touching his lips. I am a professional, I corrected, setting the bottle down. And I am 12 minutes away from a viable serum, so save your growling. We waited in a tense, suspended silence. I paced the narrow floor, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, hiding how violently my hands were shaking. I was terrified. If this failed, I had no backup plan. If this failed, he was going to die in this freezing room, and I was going to have to watch. The centrifuge slowly ground to a halt. Ding! I rushed to the counter, my heart in my throat. I popped the lid and carefully pulled out the primary glass vial. The serum was supposed to be a clear golden amber, a perfect biological synthesis. I held the vial up to the beam of the flashlight. The liquid inside was a putrid, thick, and utterly dead shade of gray. The serum had failed. I stared at the glass vial, the beam of the heavy-duty flashlight illuminating the absolute worst-case scenario. The liquid wasn't supposed to be dead, opaque gray. It was supposed to be a translucent, biological amber. It looked like dirty dishwater, thick and entirely useless. The silence in the clinic was suddenly shattered by a wet, agonizing sound behind me. I spun around. The vial slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the linoleum in a spray of gray sludge and broken glass. Torin wasn't on the cot anymore. He was on his hands and knees on the floor, his massive shoulders heaving violently. A dark, terrifying network of black veins had spiderwebbed up his neck, crawling across his jawline and creeping toward his temples. The invincible Alpha King was suddenly writhing on the freezing tiles, brought entirely to his knees by a microscopic failure. Torin! I dropped to the floor beside him, my knees slamming painfully into the hard ground. I grabbed his shoulders, trying to haul him upright, but his internal furnace was catastrophically breaking down. The man who had been running at 105 degrees just moments ago was suddenly, violently shivering. His skin felt like wet marble. The pathogen had completely overrun his nervous system, shutting down his body's ability to thermoregulate. "Don't," he choked out, his voice a ragged, unrecognizable rasp. He tried to push me away, but his heavy arm simply collapsed under its own weight. Pure, unadulterated terror spiked in my chest. My throat closed up tightly. It was the same familiar, suffocating panic I had felt when I was 8 years old, watching the taillights of my mother's car disappear down the driveway. It was the exact same helplessness. Everyone I ever cared about eventually left or died. And now, the most terrifying, infuriating man I had ever met was doing both right in front of me. "I am not letting you do this," I snapped, my voice cracking wildly as I ripped my heavy winter coat off and threw it over his shaking torso. "You do not get to die on my shift. Do you hear me?" His golden eyes rolled back, fluttering as he fought desperately to stay conscious. His breathing was coming in shallow, frantic hitches. I lunged for my open trauma kit on the floor, frantically digging through the sterile gauze and surgical tape until my fingers closed around the thick plastic barrel of a cardiac adrenaline pen. I ripped the safety cap off with my teeth. Torin's hand suddenly shot out, his icy fingers wrapping weakly around my wrist. The grip was a fraction of his usual strength, but the sheer desperation behind it froze me in place. His eyes locked onto mine. The irises had bled entirely to gold, the human pupil barely a pinprick. The toxin was stripping away the last remnants of the man, leaving only the dying animal. "Vera," he gasped, his chest shuddering violently. "Let it go. The pack. Warn them. Save yourself." The absolute surrender in his voice broke something fundamental inside my chest. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He wasn't commanding. He was just a leader accepting the final, brutal cost of his crown. "Shut up," I whispered fiercely, tears of pure frustration blurring my vision. I twisted my wrist out of his failing grip, reversed my hold on the heavy plastic injector, and slammed the needle directly into his thigh muscle. I hit the plunger with the heel of my hand. "I decide when my patients die." The effect was violently instantaneous. Torin arched off the floor, a massive, breathless roar ripping from his chest as the pure epinephrine hit his failing heart. His eyes snapped wide open, the pupils dilating massively. He gripped the edge of the examination cot, his knuckles turning stark white as he hauled his 200-pound frame off the tiles, leaning heavily against the metal frame. His chest heaved, pulling in desperate, ragged gasps of freezing air. The black veins on his neck temporarily retreated, pushed back by the massive chemical surge in his bloodstream. "You have exactly 20 minutes before that wears off," I gasped, scrambling up from the floor and rushing back to the microscope. "Do not move. Do not speak. Just breathe." I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed the battery-powered laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard with frantic, terrifying speed. I pulled up the chemical breakdown of the failed gray serum, cross-referencing it with the heavy, advanced exotic pathology textbook I had propped open against the centrifuge. "Why did it fail?" I muttered, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes. The protein binders were perfect. The saline ratio was exact. Why did it turn gray? I heard Torin shift behind me. The heavy rustle of my winter coat sliding off his shoulders was followed by a low, exhausted groan. The adrenaline was stabilizing him, but it was a crude, temporary bridge over a massive biological chasm. I could smell the sharp, metallic tang of his sweat mixing with the ozone in the room. Time was literally evaporating. "The immune system," I whispered, tracing the lines of text on the glowing screen. I grabbed a fresh slide from the failed batch and shoved it under the microscope lens. I squinted into the eyepiece, manually twisting the focus dial. The biological battlefield came into terrifying clarity. The clear amber enzymes I had engineered were perfect. But Torin's own white blood cells, hyper-aggressive alpha-strain biological defenders, were attacking the cure. His immune system was so violently territorial that it was destroying the very medicine trying to save him. "Your body is rejecting it," I said aloud, my voice echoing in the cold room. "Your alpha biology is identifying the synthetic enzymes as a secondary threat. It's neutralizing the cure before it can attack the toxin." Torin let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "My own biology is killing me." "It's doing its job too well," I corrected, frantically flipping the heavy pages of the textbook. "I need an immunosuppressant, but a chemical one will stop your heart completely." My finger traced down the column of a highly theoretical chapter on exotic sensory pathology. My heart gave a sudden, violent kick against my ribs as I read the bolded heading: "Olfactory anchoring and autoimmune de-escalation." "No," I breathed, reading the paragraph twice to make sure the dim emergency lighting wasn't playing tricks on my exhausted brain. In hypervigilant canine variants, aggressive autoimmune rejection can be bypassed via strict, uninterrupted pheromonal grounding. The introduction of a recognized, non-threatening biological scent profile tricks the nervous system into a state of passive acceptance, allowing foreign enzymes to synthesize safely. I slowly looked up from the textbook, staring at the darkened reflection of the lab window. The only way to trick his alpha immune system into accepting the cure was to introduce a biological anchor. It required a constant, heavy saturation of human pheromones to convince his brain that the environment was safe. There was only one human in a 50-mile radius. I turned around slowly. Torin was watching me, his chest rising and falling heavily, the borrowed time of the adrenaline ticking down in his golden eyes. The cure required me. "Take off the scrubs," I ordered, my voice trembling entirely against my will. Torin blinked, his heavy brow furrowing in confusion. The adrenaline was beginning to wane, and the exhaustion was creeping back into his posture. "Excuse me?" "Take off the shirt, Torin. Now. We have maybe 4 minutes before your heart rate plummets again." I grabbed a fresh syringe, hastily drawing a new batch of the clear amber serum directly from the primary beaker, intentionally bypassing the centrifuge process. He didn't argue. He reached down, gripped the hem of the mint green fabric, and pulled it over his head, tossing it onto the floor. The freezing air immediately hit his bare skin, but he didn't shiver. He just sat on the edge of the cot, watching me approach with the needle. "This is the exact same serum," Torin noted, his voice low and wary as he eyed the syringe. "You said my body rejected it." "It did. So we are going to bypass your immune response entirely," I said, my face flushing with a sudden, overwhelming heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Hold perfectly still." I didn't give him a warning. I stepped directly between his parted knees, uncapped the syringe, and injected the amber serum straight into his left deltoid. Before he could even flinch from the needle, I dropped the plastic barrel onto the mattress, took a deep, shaky breath, and wrapped both of my arms tightly around his neck. I stepped fully into his space, pressing my entire body flush against his bare chest. Torin went absolutely rigid. For a second, I thought he might actually throw me across the room. His hands hovered in the air, hovering inches from my waist, completely paralyzed by the sudden, aggressive proximity. "Breathe," I instructed, burying my face into the crook of his shoulder, my voice muffled against his skin. "Deep breaths, right against my neck. Do it now." "Vera." "It's a pheromone protocol," I blurted out, my heart hammering so violently I was certain it was going to bruise my ribs. "Your immune system needs an anchor to accept the synthetic enzymes. Just inhale, you stubborn idiot." I felt him swallow hard. Then, slowly, his massive hands settled onto my lower back. The heat of his palms bled right through the heavy fabric of my sweater. He lowered his head, pressing his nose directly against the wildly beating pulse point beneath my jaw. He took a slow, incredibly deep breath. The reaction was instantaneous. The rigid, defensive tension in his massive frame completely evaporated. A low, shuddering rumble started deep in his chest, a sound of pure biological relief. His arms tightened around me, pulling me impossibly closer, completely enveloping me in his overwhelming heat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The heavy, suffocating panic in the room faded, replaced by an atmosphere that was entirely too quiet and entirely too intimate. The serum was working. His heart rate had settled into a strong, steady rhythm against my own. I awkwardly cleared my throat, trying to pull my head back. "Okay, I think the primary enzymes have synthesized. I need to check your chart." His arms immediately clamped down like iron vices. "No," Torin murmured, his lips brushing against my collarbone. "Torin, let me go. I have to document the biological timeline." He didn't move. The terrifying, dying alpha was gone. In his place was a fully stabilized, incredibly arrogant, and violently clingy apex predator who had just been prescribed my personal space as medicine. I sighed, shifting my weight. I reached blindly behind me, managing to grab the plastic clipboard off the adjacent tray. I awkwardly wedged it between us, trying to write left-handed while he continued to bury his face in my neck. "You are making this incredibly difficult," I grumbled, crossing out a wildly illegible line of notes. "I am following medical instructions," he rasped, his voice thick with a dark, humorous amusement that sent a dangerous shiver down my spine. "Uninterrupted pheromonal grounding. Your words, doctor." "I also need coffee to maintain my professional sanity," I countered, finally managing to wriggle my hips backward, breaking the physical seal between us for a split second. I took exactly one step toward the door. Torin didn't even open his eyes. He just reached out, hooked his thick finger through the heavy denim belt loop of my jeans, and effortlessly yanked me backward. I let out a very undignified squeak as I tumbled directly onto his lap. His arms instantly locked around my waist, securing me firmly against his chest. He leaned in, his lips grazing my ear, his tone dropping into that terrifying, resonant command. "Doctor's orders, Vera. Stay." I sat frozen on his lap for exactly 3 seconds, my brain completely short-circuiting as the sheer size and heat of him thoroughly wrecked my professional composure. Then, my survival instincts violently booted back online. "Absolutely not," I gasped, planting both hands squarely against his broad chest and shoving backward with all my might. Torin didn't even budge, but the sheer indignity of my scrambling caused him to let out a low, vibrating chuckle. He released his grip just enough for me to practically fall backward onto the linoleum, my boots scrambling for traction. I scrambled up, aggressively smoothing the front of my sweater, my face burning so hot I was surprised it didn't set off the clinic's smoke detectors. "I am checking your vitals," I announced to the wall, marching toward the counter and grabbing the battery-operated blood pressure cuff. "And you are going to sit there and behave like a standard cooperative patient." To my immense frustration, the serum had worked entirely too well. As the minutes ticked by, the crushing, lethal pallor of the biotoxin completely vanished from Torin's skin. The dark veins receded, his golden eyes sharpened, losing that hazy, dying glaze and returning to a terrifying, calculating clarity. And with his physical strength came the immediate, overwhelming return of his colossal ego. "The ambient temperature is dropping again," Torin noted, rolling his heavy shoulders as he stood up from the cot. He completely ignored the blood pressure cuff I was holding. "Check the seals on the exterior storm shutters. The wind is shifting." I stopped dead in my tracks, the cuff dangling from my hand. "Excuse me?" "The shutters," he repeated, pointing a massive finger toward the front lobby. "And while you're at it, find a radio battery that isn't corroded. I need to establish a comm link with my border enforcers before sunrise." I stared at him, sheer disbelief battling with rising fury. Less than an hour ago, he was writhing on the floor, begging me to let him die to save his pack. Now, he was standing in the middle of my clinic, wearing mint green scrub pants, treating me like a low-level administrative assistant. "I am not your personal butler," I snapped, tossing the cuff onto the metal tray. "And I am certainly not checking the storm shutters while we are trapped in a Category 4 whiteout. I am a doctor. The doctor who just pulled you out of biological organ failure, I might add." "And I am grateful," Torin said dismissively, pacing the length of the lab with that tight, predatory stride. "But the immediate medical crisis is over. Now I have a territorial crisis to manage. Get the radio." "No." He stopped pacing. The heavy, intimidating silence stretched between us. He slowly turned his head, his golden eyes narrowing in warning. "Doctor, do not doctor me," I interrupted, my voice rising, fueled by the sheer exhaustion and adrenaline of the last 10 hours. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to use me as your literal biological life support, practically suffocate me in personal space, and then flip a switch and act like an arrogant, emotionally unavailable dictator the second your pulse stabilizes. Torin fully squared his shoulders, his imposing height suddenly feeling suffocating. I am an alpha. I do not have the luxury of being emotionally available. My pack is under attack. Your pack is asleep, I shouted, throwing my hands in the air. And you are using them as an excuse to hide how absolutely terrified you are of needing anyone else. You use your title like a shield, so you don't have to admit that you were completely helpless 10 minutes ago. The air in the room violently snapped. Torin crossed the floor in 3 massive, terrifying strides. He backed me directly into the stainless steel counter, his hands slamming onto the metal edge on either side of my hips, caging me in completely. His chest heaved, his face inches from mine, the heat rolling off his skin in aggressive, dizzying waves. You think I want to need you this much? He snarled, his voice breaking on a ragged edge of pure desperation. It's killing me. The echo of his shout rang off the cold tile walls, leaving behind a sudden, heavy vacuum. I was entirely trapped between his arms, the cool metal of the counter biting into my lower back. I expected him to push away, to retreat behind that impenetrable wall of arrogance. Instead, the fury in his golden eyes slowly fractured, replaced by a dark, intense vulnerability that was infinitely more dangerous. He didn't move. He simply leaned a fraction closer, the scent of ozone and earth completely enveloping my senses. I'm not scared of you, I lied, my voice shaking in the exact same way it had in the supply closet hours ago. Torin didn't argue. He didn't smirk. He slowly tilted his head down, his ear hovering just inches from the wildly erratic pulse point at the base of my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath, but my biology was entirely betraying me. My heart was slamming against my ribs like a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Your heartbeat disagrees, he murmured, his breath warm and devastating against my skin. It's the adrenaline, I croaked out, gripping the edge of the counter behind my back so tightly my knuckles ached. I just yelled at a 200-pound man. It's a standard stress response. He lifted his head, his gaze locking onto mine. The absolute certainty in his expression stripped away every single defensive wall I had spent my entire adult life building. You aren't terrified of my temper, Vera, Torin said quietly, the resonant command in his voice softening into something agonizingly gentle. You aren't afraid I'm going to hurt you. You're terrified because you know exactly what I am feeling. And you realize you're feeling the exact same thing. I am a medical professional, I stammered, frantically trying to deploy my usual sarcasm to deflect the sheer panic rising in my chest. I don't feel anything for my patients, except a strong desire to properly bill their insurance. Stop, he commanded softly. He slowly lifted his right hand from the counter. I flinched slightly, but he didn't reach for my waist or my shoulders. Instead, he gently pressed the pad of his heavy, calloused thumb directly against the racing pulse point beneath my jaw. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight down my spine. My breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. You analyze everything in this clinic under a microscope, Torin whispered, his thumb slowly stroking the fragile skin, tracking the frantic rhythm of my heart. But you can't put this on a glass slide. You can't chart it. You can't control it. And that terrifies you more than a pathogen ever could. He was entirely right. The paralyzing fear of attachment, The absolute certainty that if I let him in, he would eventually leave was suffocating me. I wanted to push him away. I wanted to hit him with the medical textbook again. But the sheer, grounding heat of his hand against my neck kept me completely paralyzed. "Admit it," he urged, his voice dropping to a gravelly, coaxing whisper as he leaned in, his lips hovering a breath away from mine. "Just admit it, Vera." My eyelids fluttered shut. The logical, clinical part of my brain finally surrendered to the undeniable, biological gravity between us. I parted my lips to speak, to finally give him the truth. A massive, deafening clack echoed through the building. The emergency red lighting violently snapped off, plunging us into total darkness for a split second, before the massive overhead fluorescent bulbs exploded into blinding, sterile white light. The hum of the central heating unit violently roared to life, drowning out the wind. The clinic's primary power grid had surged back online. I violently flinched backward, breaking his touch as the harsh, blinding lights flooded the examination room. The intimate, heavy atmosphere shattered instantly, replaced by the clinical, unforgiving reality of the veterinary hospital. The primary computer monitors on the far counter chimed in a synchronized, cheery sequence as their main servers rebooted. Torin blinked, his pupils constricting against the sudden glare. The moment of vulnerability vanished, safely locked away beneath the glaring fluorescence. "The power," I gasped, my voice sounding entirely too thin. I scrambled out from between his arms, practically diving across the room toward the main diagnostic terminal. "The storm must have broken the main grid freeze. The primary lab equipment is back online." I didn't wait for his response. I needed the science. I desperately needed the sterile, predictable numbers to ground my spiraling emotions. I grabbed the final vial of his blood, the one drawn right after the pheromone protocol, and shoved it into the main high-capacity centrifuge. "What are you doing?" Torin asked, his heavy footsteps sounding behind me as he approached the counter. "Running a full-spectrum diagnostic," I typed frantically on the keyboard, pulling up the deep cellular analysis software. "The emergency battery spectrometer only gave us surface-level enzyme markers. I need to see exactly how your immune system integrated the synthetic cure at a molecular level." The machine whirred with high-speed precision. 3 minutes later, a massive, highly detailed biological chart populated the dual screens in front of me. I leaned forward, my clinical brain rapidly scanning the complex protein chains. The toxin was completely eradicated. The synthetic cure had bonded perfectly. But as my eyes tracked down to the autoimmune anchoring sector, my breath caught entirely in my throat. "No," I whispered, the words slipping out in pure, unadulterated horror. "What is it?" Torin demanded, instantly stepping up beside me, his golden eyes scanning the screen. "Is the pathogen mutating?" "No," I said, my voice entirely hollow. I pointed a trembling finger at a highly irregular, looping strand of code highlighted in bright red on the monitor. "The pathogen is gone, but the cure..." "Torin, the synthetic enzymes couldn't just temporarily trick your immune system. In order to anchor permanently, they had to biologically mirror the pheromonal signature present during the synthesis." He stared at me, his heavy brow furrowing. "Explain that in English, doctor." I slowly turned to face him, the crushing weight of my deepest, darkest fear crashing over me like a tidal wave. "It means your alpha biology didn't just accept the medicine." I forced the words past the tight knot in my throat. "It assimilated my specific biological marker into your baseline nervous system. You are permanently synced to my proximity." The silence in the room was absolute. "If you leave this clinic," I continued, tears of pure, devastating realization pricking the corners of my eyes. "If you go back to your territory without me, your immune system will recognize the absence of my pheromones as a critical system failure. The insomnia will return. The biological instability will return tenfold. Your body will literally attack itself until you are near me again." I wasn't a partner to him. I wasn't a woman he had chosen. I was a lifelong, inescapable prescription pad. The chemistry, the tension, the heartbeat betrayal. It was all a biological lie engineered by his failing nervous system. Torin stared at the glowing red strand on the monitor, his expression entirely unreadable. Then, he slowly turned his head to look at me, absorbing the absolute devastation written across my face. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking violently beneath his skin. "You think I planned this?" I laughed, a sharp, entirely humorless sound that scraped the back of my throat like shattered glass. "I think your biology made a highly tactical decision to take a hostage, Torin. That's what I think." I spun away from the main diagnostic terminal, the harsh, fluorescent lights practically burning my retinas. The sterile, predictable sanctuary of my clinic had been entirely violated. I wasn't a doctor anymore. I was a biological tether. I marched toward the staff locker room, my heavy boots striking the linoleum with aggressive, rhythmic finality. "Vera, stop," Torin commanded, his heavy footsteps trailing right behind me, shaking the floorboards. "Do not use that voice on me," I shouted, yanking open the metal door of my locker so hard the hinges shrieked. I grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bag and started indiscriminately shoving my spare mint green scrubs, my backup stethoscope, and a half-eaten box of dry granola bars inside. "Your terrifying alpha routine does not work when I have the literal lab results proving that your feelings are nothing more than a desperate chemical survival tactic." "That is not what this is," he growled. He stepped into the narrow locker room, his massive frame immediately eclipsing the doorway and making the space feel entirely suffocating. The overwhelming heat radiating off his skin clashed violently with the frigid air still trapped in the back of the clinic. He reached out to grab the canvas strap of my bag, but I violently yanked it out of his reach. "Don't touch me," I snapped, my voice cracking wildly against my will. "You don't get to touch me anymore. The medical crisis is over. The pathogen is gone. You're cured. And all it cost was my entire autonomy." "Your autonomy is fine." "I am your medicine," I screamed, the devastating truth finally tearing out of my chest, raw and bleeding. I threw the heavy duffel bag onto the metal bench between us, creating a flimsy physical barrier. "Do you not understand the pathology? If I walk out that door, you die. If I stay, I spend the rest of my life trapped in a psychological prison, constantly wondering if you actually want me, or if your compromised nervous system is just terrifyingly dependent on my proximity so you can get a decent night's sleep." I absolutely refuse to be a walking prescription pad for the king of the Midwest. Torin stared at me, his broad chest heaving with every ragged breath. The sheer, overwhelming panic in his golden eyes was startling. He was a man who commanded hundreds of enforcers, an apex predator who solved territorial disputes with fangs and lethal force. But standing here, against a woman armed with nothing but emotional logic and a clipboard, he was entirely, utterly powerless. "I am not letting you leave," he said, his voice dropping into a dark, desperate rumble that vibrated the metal lockers. He planted his bare feet firmly in the doorway, crossing his massive arms over his chest, effectively sealing me inside. "Watch me," I whispered. I grabbed the duffel bag, lowered my shoulder, and shoved aggressively past him. He didn't brace his core. He didn't fight back. He simply let me push his immovable weight aside, entirely too terrified of accidentally hurting me to use his massive physical advantage. I marched straight down the main hallway toward the lobby, my vision blurring with furious tears. I slammed my palm against the glowing green emergency override button on the wall. A massive mechanical groan echoed through the entire building. The heavy steel storm shutters slowly, agonizingly ground upward. The blizzard had finally broken. Pale, blinding morning sunlight flooded the lobby, revealing a towering wall of plowed snow and the distant mechanical hum of city snowplows. The storm was over. The world was wide open. The frigid, razor-sharp morning air rushed through the slowly cracking automatic doors, instantly biting at my flushed cheeks and violently tangling my hair. I stood frozen on the rubber lobby mat, the heavy canvas strap of my duffel bag digging painfully into my shoulder. The downtown Chicago street was eerily silent, buried under 3 feet of pristine white snow. It was a beautiful, frozen escape path, just waiting for me to step out. But before my boot could even touch the icy pavement, a massive shadow eclipsed the blinding morning sunlight. Torin stepped directly between me and the exit. The biting, sub-zero wind rolled over his bare, heavily scarred chest and the thin cotton of his scrub pants, but he didn't even flinch. He didn't shiver. He didn't loom over me, and he didn't try to use his overwhelming size to physically cage me against the glass doors. He just stood there, entirely exposed to the elements, and entirely exposed to me. "Move, Torin," I rasped, stubbornly refusing to look up into his eyes. I stared resolutely at the center of his chest, watching the steady, even rise and fall of his breathing. "The snowplows are out. The roads are clearing. You can use the landline to call your border enforcers to come pick you up." "I don't care about the enforcers right now," he said. His voice wasn't the resonant, terrifying command of an alpha. It was devastatingly quiet. It was rough, broken, and completely stripped of his arrogant, untouchable ego. "Then care about your own survival," I shot back, aggressively blinking away the hot tears threatening to spill over my lashes. "If you go back to your territory and check in with my clinic once a week, we might be able to artificially synthesize a pheromone patch. I can run blood panels to monitor the autoimmune response. Vera, look at me." I stubbornly kept my eyes glued to the floor. "I am trying to give you a viable, long-term medical solution." "I don't want a medical solution," he practically begged, the raw, visceral desperation in his tone finally forcing my chin up. The invincible king was completely gone. His golden eyes were wide, frantic, and filled with an agonizing vulnerability that completely shattered the very last bricks in my defensive wall. He slowly lifted his hands, keeping his palms open and facing upward, a universal, primal gesture of absolute surrender from a man who had never surrendered to anyone in his life. "My biology didn't choose you," Torin whispered, taking one single, agonizingly slow step closer. He didn't invade my personal space. He simply stood at the absolute edge of it, letting his overwhelming heat battle the freezing wind. "The serum, the biological sink. It didn't create anything that wasn't already there. It just locked on to the one thing in this room that my mind already valued more than my own life." My breath hitched entirely. That's a lie. You hated me when you woke up in that cage." I was terrified of you, he corrected softly, a faint, exhausted smile touching his lips. You hit me in the chest with a pathology textbook. You sprayed me in the face with a reptile water bottle. You looked a 200-pound monster in the eye and demanded I put on pants or face the consequences. You are the most infuriating, brilliant, terrifying woman I have ever met. And my heart belonged to you hours before that centrifuge ever dinged. I stood completely paralyzed, the heavy canvas bag slipping slightly off my shoulder. The absolute, staggering weight of his words settled deep into my freezing bones. He wasn't demanding obedience. He wasn't asserting his dominance. He was offering a complete, irrevocable partnership. He was placing his crown and his life entirely in my hands. The cold wind howled softly through the cracked doors. The low hum of the clinic's central heaters purred behind us. The extreme sensory contrast of the freezing exit and his radiating, overwhelming warmth perfectly mirrored the impossible choice sitting heavy and unresolved in my chest. Torin held my gaze for one long, agonizing second. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped aside. He left the path to the open door entirely clear. "Leave if you have to," Torin murmured, his voice thick with a dark, resolved agony. "I won't stop you. But no, I will spend the rest of my life wishing you stayed." The lobby was dead silent. The winter sun glinted sharply off the titanium lock of the reinforced glass doors. I let out a long, shuddering breath, my knuckles turning stark white as my hand slowly reached out, wrapping tightly around the freezing metal of the doorknob.